Starting tomorrow, my boyfriend and his parents are moving in here, my younger sister announced at our weekend family dinner, setting down her fork like she'd just made a routine scheduling update rather than a demand. If you have a problem with that, you can move out. I just smiled. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. The next morning, when 3 moving trucks showed up at the curb, they were met by something none of them expected to see waiting for them instead. But to understand why my silence at that dinner table was so much more dangerous than any argument I could have made, you need to know something about that house that my sister had never once bothered to ask about. My name is Renata Cole. I'm 34, and I work as a residential property manager for a mid-sized real estate firm, overseeing lease compliance and tenant disputes for roughly 40 properties across the city. It's a detail that will matter considerably more than it might initially seem. My parents, Diane and Walter Cole, bought the house I'm talking about, a modest 4-bedroom on Fenwick Street, almost 30 years ago, when my sister Brooke and I were both still small children. I moved back in 4 years ago in my early 30s, after a difficult divorce left me needing to rebuild financially, an arrangement my parents welcomed warmly, especially once I began contributing significantly to household expenses and eventually, quietly, taking over most of the property's maintenance and financial management as my parents aged into their late 60s. Brooke, 6 years younger than me, moved back in around the same time, following a series of financial setbacks of her own, most involving boyfriends whose plans always seemed to require significant financial support that never quite came from them. I want to be honest about the family dynamic that developed over those 4 years, because it matters for understanding what came next. Brooke has always been, in my parents' words, the sensitive one, a framing that, over decades, translated into a pattern where conflict with Brooke was avoided rather than addressed, where her financial requests were met rather than questioned, and where, increasingly as my parents aged, I found myself quietly absorbing the practical, unglamorous work of actually running the household, while Brooke absorbed most of its emotional deference. I don't say this with resentment exactly, though I understand if it sounds that way. It's simply the shape our family had settled into, one I'd mostly made peace with, focusing my energy instead on the parts of our shared life I could actually control. 2 years ago, my parents made a decision that, at the time, felt like ordinary estate planning rather than anything dramatic. Both in their late 60s, increasingly aware of their own mortality after my father's minor heart scare that year, they met with an estate attorney to formalize what would happen to the house eventually. I want to be honest that Brooke was invited to that meeting as well, but declined to attend, telling our parents she didn't want to think about morbid stuff and trusted whatever they decided. What they decided, based on conversations I was present for and Brooke wasn't, was to transfer the deed to the Fenwick Street house into my name specifically, while my parents retained a formal life estate, meaning they retained the legal right to live in the house for the remainder of their lives, but full ownership, effective immediately rather than waiting for inheritance, passed to me. My parents explained their reasoning to me directly. Carefully, in a conversation I've thought about often since, they cited my consistent financial contributions to the household, my professional experience actually managing real estate responsibly, and more delicately a specific concern about Brooke's pattern of boyfriends who seemed to view her family home as a resource to be leveraged rather than a household to be respected. I want to be honest that I didn't fully understand the weight of what my parents had done until considerably later, because in practical daily terms, almost nothing about our household changed. I continued managing the property, continued splitting expenses with my parents, and Brooke continued living there much as she always had, apparently never once thinking to ask, in 2 years, exactly whose name was actually on the deed. Brooke's current boyfriend, a man named Dustin, entered the picture roughly 8 months before that weekend dinner. I want to be careful and fair here, because I recognize I bring professional bias to evaluating potential tenants, but I noticed, almost immediately, patterns in Dustin that concerned me specifically because of my job, references to temporary housing situations that never quite got explained clearly, a vague employment history involving several jobs that each ended, according to Brooke, because his boss was unreasonable. A comment, early on, joking but not entirely joking, about how family houses like this one are basically free rent if you play it right. I mentioned my concerns to Brooke once, carefully, months before that dinner. She told me I was being controlling and judgmental, a conversation that ended our discussion of Dustin entirely for the following several months. The weekend dinner itself unfolded almost exactly as these things do in retrospect. Obvious in hindsight, blindsiding in the moment, Brooke announced, with the casual confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed the delivery, that Dustin and his parents, whose own housing situation had apparently just collapsed due to an eviction I would later learn considerably more about, would be moving into the Fenwick Street house starting the following day. 3 additional adults, into a 4-bedroom house already comfortably occupied by 3 of us. My parents, predictably, looked distressed but said nothing forceful, the pattern of decades reasserting itself instantly. I understand, looking back, that Brooke was almost certainly counting on exactly that dynamic continuing, on my parents' habitual deference to her feelings, and, I suspect, on my own history of being the practical one who ultimately absorbed disruption rather than causing it. I smiled. I said simply, "Okay, Brooke. We'll see how tomorrow goes." I want to be honest that my calm in that moment wasn't composure I had to work hard to maintain. It was, genuinely, the calm of someone who already understood something Brooke apparently didn't. I want to walk through what I did that evening, after dinner, because the sequence matters. I called my own attorney, a colleague I'd worked with professionally on tenant matters for years. Not out of any dramatic intention to escalate things, but simply to confirm what I already understood professionally, that as the sole legal owner of the property, I retained full legal authority over who could occupy it, an authority that superseded any informal permission Brooke, as a family member without ownership interest, believed herself entitled to extend to Dustin and his parents. My attorney confirmed what I expected, and additionally flagged something I hadn't fully considered. Given that Dustin's parents were, according to what Brooke had described, actively displaced from a prior residence due to eviction, allowing them to move in without any formal lease agreement or background review could expose me, as property owner, to complicated tenant rights entanglements down the line if I ever needed to ask them to leave later, once emotions had cooled and the situation felt less urgent. The following morning, I want to be honest, wasn't purely about protecting my legal position. It was also, I recognize now, about finally, clearly asserting a boundary I'd spent years avoiding for the sake of family peace. When the first moving truck arrived, along with Dustin, his parents, and Brooke, all visibly ready to begin unloading, they were met not by an empty driveway welcoming them in, but by me, standing on the porch, along with a printed copy of the deed and a formal, notarized letter my attorney had prepared overnight. I explained, calmly, the same tone I'd used at dinner the night before, that I was the sole legal owner of the property, that no one besides myself, my parents, and Brooke held any legal right of occupancy, and that Dustin and his parents were welcome to discuss a formal, standard lease arrangement with me directly, subject to the same background and financial screening I'd apply to any prospective tenant professionally, but that they could not simply move in that day without any such agreement in place. I want to describe Brooke's reaction honestly, because it matters for understanding the deeper pattern underneath this specific conflict. Her shock in that driveway wasn't simply about the logistics of the day falling apart. It was, I think, the first moment in years she'd been confronted directly with the reality that her assumed authority within our family home had never actually been backed by any real legal standing, an assumption she'd apparently never once thought to verify into. Years of living in a house whose ownership had quietly changed entirely without her ever asking a single question about it. Dustin's reaction told me something separately important. Rather than any confusion or embarrassment on Brooke's behalf, his first response was frustration directed specifically at the delay itself, followed quickly by a comment to his own parents, loud enough for me to hear clearly, about finding somewhere else that doesn't have this much red tape. A comment that struck me less as someone caught in an awkward misunderstanding, and more as someone accustomed to needing housing situations to move quickly. with minimal scrutiny. That comment sent me looking further into Dustin's background over the following days, using the same professional screening resources I use for actual prospective tenants. What I found clarified considerably why he'd seemed so specifically drawn to the idea of a family-owned house with an absent, deferential ownership structure rather than pursuing standard rental housing through conventional channels. Dustin had, over the previous 6 years, been party to 3 separate eviction proceedings across 2 different states, each one, according to the court records I located, following a similar pattern, moving into a partner's or family member's property informally, without a documented lease, and then resisting departure for months once the relationship soured or the arrangement became inconvenient for the property owner, relying specifically on the legal complications that arise when occupancy exists without formal lease documentation. His parents' current housing collapse, it turned out, followed an identical pattern. An informal arrangement with a family friend that had similarly deteriorated into a prolonged, legally complicated eviction process the friend was apparently still working through. Months later, I shared this information with Brooke directly, along with the actual court documents, roughly a week after the driveway confrontation. I want to be honest that this conversation, unlike the dinner announcement or the driveway standoff, was considerably harder for both of us, because it required Brooke to reckon not just with a legal boundary I'd enforced, but with a pattern in her own relationship choices that this incident had inadvertently exposed. Brooke ended her relationship with Dustin within the following month, a decision I want to be clear I never pushed her toward directly, simply providing the documented facts and letting her reach her own conclusion about what they meant. My relationship with my parents, through all of this, actually deepened rather than strained, once they understood clearly that the ownership decision they'd made 2 years earlier had functioned exactly as intended, protecting the household from precisely the kind of situation they'd quietly worried about when making it. My father told me a few weeks later that watching me handle that driveway conversation calmly, without anger, was the clearest proof we'd made the right call. My relationship with Brooke remains, honestly, still recalibrating. She's expressed genuine gratitude, in quieter moments since, for what the situation revealed about Dustin before things went further. But there's also, understandably, a harder adjustment happening underneath that gratitude, the recognition that the family dynamic she'd relied on for most of her adult life, one where her preferences generally prevailed by default, has permanently shifted into something more equal and considerably less automatic than it used to be. I think about that dinner table moment often, the specific choice to smile rather than argue. I understand now that the smile wasn't simply composure. It was, in a way, I couldn't have fully articulated in the moment. The quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 2 years managing a household's actual responsibilities, while everyone around her assumed the old, informal hierarchy still applied. Sometimes the strongest response to an unreasonable demand isn't a louder argument. Sometimes it's simply already having, quietly, legally, and years in advance, exactly the standing required to answer it, without needing to raise your voice at all. If you've made it this far with me, do. You think Brooke would have ever questioned Dustin's intentions if this situation hadn't forced the issue, or do you think she was already starting to notice the same patterns you did? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning.